My own son gave me a box of leftovers, then whispered that I should enjoy it while I still lived here. That same week, he drained my savings. 3.6 million gone. He and his wife laughed behind my back, already planning how to kick me out of my own house. I didn't scream. I waited. Because what they took from me wasn't just money, it was my name. And I was going to take it back, louder than they ever imagined. He handed me a plastic box of cold mashed potatoes and a dry slice of meatloaf. Then, right in front of his guests, he chuckled and said, "She's just visiting anyway. This house belongs to us now." There was a flicker of awkward laughter, the kind that happens when people don't know if something cruel was meant as a joke or not. I sat on the edge of the kitchen chair, holding that container in both hands like it might fall apart. No plate, no napkin, just leftovers. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. The shame had already settled into my chest like a weight I couldn't push off. Lila, my daughter-in-law, clinked her glass against Derek's. "To the new chapter," she smiled, "and to finally making the place feel like ours." They toasted over sparkling wine. I sat in silence, chewing a piece of meat that tasted like cardboard. My name was still on the deed, but in their eyes, I had already been erased. That night, after the last guest left, Derek stood by the fridge with his arms crossed. He didn't look at me when he said, "It would make everything smoother if you signed that financial release we talked about." I told him I wasn't ready, that I needed time. He shrugged and walked away. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was watering the potted basil on the patio. 3 alerts, then 5, then 10. Savings account, $3,624,200. The screen blurred. My hands were shaking. I checked the other accounts. Locked. Every last cent I had built over decades of work. Gone. No call, no request. Just gone. I walked inside. Lila was sitting on the couch with her legs curled up, sipping iced coffee. She looked up at me like I was a stray cat tracking mud onto her rug. "You said you trusted us," she said flatly. "This just makes things easier." Then she picked up the remote and turned up the volume on her show. That same evening, a locksmith pulled into the driveway. I was told not to worry. "Just replacing the front hardware," Derek said. "Safety upgrade." But that night, when I came back from a short walk, my key no longer fit. I knocked. Lila opened the door an inch and tossed me a new one, attached to a cheap red tag. "This one only works for the side door," she said. "Keeps things separate. You understand?" I understood. I went to bed that night on a creaky twin mattress in the laundry room, surrounded by boxes they said they would help me unpack months ago. They never did. My name was no longer spoken in the main living room. My presence became a background inconvenience. That week, Derek asked me again to sign a clean-up document for the financial accounts. He used a notary this time. She never made eye contact with me. I signed because I had no fight left. Or at least, they thought I didn't. After they left, I sat on the porch and stared at the waterline of the canal. My son had taken my food, my money, my name. And now, he and his wife wanted my home. But I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't call anyone crying. What I did instead was listen to every word, every whisper, every step they took around me as if I no longer mattered. And somewhere in all that silence, I began to move differently. I started taking notes. I started recording what they served me and when. I documented every transaction I could pull. I sat with a lawyer. I called a banker. I mapped out what they would never see coming. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't loud, it's precise. To anyone listening right now who has ever felt invisible in their own home, who has been pushed aside like an afterthought. Let me tell you something. You are not done. They don't know what you know. They don't see what you see. They don't feel what you are building inside yourself. They took what was mine, but they forgot one thing. I'm still here, and I know how to fight back. The locksmith came at noon, not early in the morning when people fix things quietly, not late at night when there's some dignity in privacy. He showed up exactly at noon, when the sun was highest, and the neighbors were most likely to be outside trimming hedges or walking their dogs. Visibility, I later realized, was intentional. I had just finished folding a small load of laundry when I heard the drilling. The front door was wide open. Derek was standing with his arms crossed, watching the man work. He didn't say a word to me. I stepped into the hallway and stared, waiting. Nothing. The sound of the drill screamed against the wood, louder than anything either of them could have said. Lila came around the corner with her phone in her hand, smirking like this was an upgrade she had been waiting for. "New locks, safer for everyone," she said, then walked off without another word. I watched as the locksmith replaced the deadbolt, tested the new latch, and handed Derek a set of shiny silver keys. Derek turned, finally noticing me there. "I'll get you one later," he said. "Just use the side door for now." I didn't respond. I walked past him, slowly, out the front door, and kept walking. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I needed to be somewhere else, even for a minute. By the time I got back, the side door was unlocked, and a small envelope sat on the dryer in the laundry room. Inside was a key attached to a red tag. Handwritten in Derek's messy teenage scrawl were the words, "Side only." No explanation, no warmth, just a message. "You are separate now." That night, they hosted a dinner party. Just a few couples from Derek's job. I was told to stay in the back, in my part of the house. I sat on the edge of the bed with my palms flat against my knees, listening to their laughter through the walls. Lila's voice rang the loudest, talking about renovations. She mentioned opening up the living room, adding French doors to the patio. She called it our property. My hands clenched. They weren't planning to ask. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were actively taking what was still mine, piece by piece, starting with the locks and ending with my name. In the morning, Derek came knocking on the laundry room door with a thin manila folder in his hand. A notary followed him in, barely making eye contact. "This is just a cleanup of what you already signed. For the bank. Nothing complicated." I read the top line and recognized the terms. It was a permanent release. This document would lock them in as financial controllers and strip me of all legal say. It wasn't a clarification. It was a trap. Still, I signed. Quietly. Deliberately. I didn't ask questions. I didn't argue. Because I knew something they didn't. Before he left, the notary placed a receipt on the table and nodded slightly toward me. Something in her eyes shifted, just enough for me to register that she knew. As soon as they walked out, I pulled out the small spiral notebook I had kept in my nightstand for years. I had once used it to track groceries and coupon days. Now it became something else. I wrote the date, time, and a full description of the document. Then I noted the key tag, the side door lock, the dinner party. I turned that page. Then I started a list. People I could still trust. There weren't many, but I didn't need many. First name I wrote was Celia Thornton, lawyer, used to work for the port. She owed me one, a big one. Second name, Walter, banker. I helped his wife through cancer treatment back when I was still working. He never forgot. Third, Mary Elliott, notary, discreet, detailed, already sensed something today. That evening, I gathered every old file I had from my retirement, my house, my accounts. I lined them up on the floor like puzzle pieces. Trusts, titles, bank letters. I found the deed. I found the original joint account creation form that listed only me. Then I circled one line in red ink, right to revoke or restrict co-signing privileges at any time. By midnight, I had filled 3 more pages in the notebook. Each detail was a bullet, each memory a map. They had taken everything they could see, but the one thing they hadn't counted on was what I kept hidden, not in safes, not in bank vaults, but in me, in what I remembered, in what I recorded, in what I had already moved beyond their reach. I closed the notebook slowly. My fingers pressed against the cover, my jaw tightened, my spine straightened. They thought I was fading. They were wrong. 3 days after the locks were changed, Derek returned with a second envelope. This time, he didn't knock. He just walked straight into the laundry room while I was folding a towel, dropped the folder on the small table near the wall, and said it was nothing serious. His voice was calm, rehearsed. He stood there, hands in his pockets, like he was doing me a favor. It just clears up some inconsistencies from the last paperwork. A bank thing. You've already signed most of it, he added. I looked at the folder but didn't reach for it. A notary walked in behind him, a different woman this time. Mid-40s, pale blouse, clipboard in hand. She didn't meet my eyes, just stood still near the doorway, waiting. Derek stayed close, hovering. "It'll only take a minute," he said. I opened the folder. The first page was laid out just like the last one, but this time with additional clauses added to the bottom. Phrases like financial surrender, binding irrevocability, and ownership transfer were stacked in clean blocks, each more final than the last. The wording was clinical, but the intention was sharp. I flipped through 2 more pages. The last one had a line already highlighted for my signature. "Sign here," Derek said, tapping twice like I was slow to follow. So I did, slowly, no questions, no hesitation. I signed exactly where he wanted. I handed the folder to the notary. She flipped through quickly, double-checked the signature, then packed up her clipboard and left without a word. Derek gave me a tight smile, nodded once, and followed her out. I heard his footsteps fade into the front hallway, and then the soft click of the front door closing. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just stood there for a long moment, my thumb pressing lightly against the table's edge, until I was sure I could move without falling. Then I pulled out the same spiral notebook I'd filled the night before, opened to a fresh page, and wrote down everything: date, time, name of the notary, description of the document, where I signed, what was said. I wrote it all down. Then I made 3 copies of the notes and sealed them in envelopes. One would go to Celia, my old lawyer at the port. One would go to Walter at the bank. The third I would keep with me, in a sealed folder marked final, stored under the floorboard behind the washer, where no one ever cleaned. The next morning, I walked 2 blocks to the library and paid for access to a public computer. I logged into my account, pulled bank records, and downloaded full statements from the last 6 months. The 3.6 million had been pulled in 6 separate transactions, staggered across different accounts under Derek's name. None of them had been authorized by me directly, at least not without the help of those forged documents he called clarifications. But I had what I needed. I printed every page, stapled them by week, and labeled each with a sticky tab in red marker. Then I booked a meeting with Celia. She responded in under 10 minutes. Her office was still in the same building near the port, 3rd floor, overlooking the old freight docks. I made it there before lunch. She gave me that look people give when they haven't seen you in years, but still remember the exact coffee you used to drink. We didn't talk much at first. I handed her the folder, sat down, and waited while she read in silence. When she finally looked up, she said one word: deliberate. That was all I needed to hear. Over the next hour, we mapped out a counterplan. We would freeze all movement on any remaining assets. We would file a quiet complaint with the recorder's office to flag any documents Derek might submit regarding the house. Most importantly, we would prepare a verified petition of undue influence based on financial coercion, elder abuse, and breach of fiduciary trust. None of that sounded dramatic, but it was powerful, and most of all, it was quiet. Derek wouldn't see it coming. Neither would Lila. On my way home, I stopped at the bank and asked to speak with Walter. I hadn't seen him in almost 5 years, not since his wife passed. He looked thinner, older, but when I told him my name, his eyes lit up like I had handed him back a piece of something he forgot he lost. I didn't need to explain much. He walked me through what he could legally show and offered to assist with internal audits on his end. By the time I returned home, the house was empty. I walked past the kitchen where they'd laughed. I passed the living room where they had toasted each other with wine. I stepped into the laundry room, locked the door, and took a breath. That night, I began recording everything. I used an old voice recorder from when I used to take phone messages at the port. I left it running during dinner prep. I kept it in my pocket when I walked through the house. I even planted one under the dining room shelf where they liked to whisper after they thought I had gone to bed. I wrote down every cruel phrase, every mention of the house, every reference to my supposed decline. They weren't just planning, they were rehearsing. The next evening, I overheard Lila on the phone with someone about a contractor. She was asking about permits. When she hung up, she left the note on the kitchen counter. I copied it, folded it into my notebook, and dated it. Then I went into the guest bathroom, took the camera I had ordered the week before out from under the sink, and installed it in the hallway facing the main entry. No one noticed, not even after 3 days. And still I said nothing, because everything they took from me, they took boldly. Everything I was about to take back, I would take quietly and permanently. It started with a whisper behind the wall. I had left the hallway recorder on that morning while I took a short walk to the end of the street. When I came back, I rewound the tape and listened while washing dishes. I wasn't even halfway through rinsing when Lila's voice came through, low and smug. "She's not going to last much longer. You saw how slow she's getting. We'll have the place to ourselves by summer." I turned off the water. My hands were still wet, soap sliding down my wrists. The words weren't loud, but they were clear. No hesitation, no kindness, just calculation. Later that evening, I found the note she left behind near the fridge, a torn piece of paper with a phone number scribbled down, along with a name I didn't recognize, and the words "contractor" for patio and locks. She hadn't even tried to hide it. They were already planning renovations like I didn't exist. I folded the paper and slid it between 2 pages in my notebook, writing the date and time. Then I went to the spare bedroom closet and took down an old storage bin. Inside were things I hadn't touched in years, back when I used to handle logistics at the port. Vendor contacts, internal memos, taped interviews from HR complaints, all neatly labeled and preserved. I didn't keep junk. I kept evidence. It was habit. By midnight, I had the names of 2 former colleagues I knew I could still count on. One worked in property records. The other had ties to local contractors. Both had seen what happened to older folks whose families tried to take things out from under them. The next morning, I went to the recorder's office in person and filed a private alert on my property file. It wasn't public, but it would trigger an internal flag if any changes were requested under my address. I marked everything confidential, cited early signs of potential coercion, and requested written notification if any attempt was made to alter the deed. From there, I walked 6 blocks to a small UPS store that offered private mailboxes. I signed up for one and listed it as my legal mailing address for all new correspondence going forward. I didn't trust Derek or Lila to leave my mail untouched anymore. Too many envelopes had arrived already, with corners opened or resealed awkwardly. By the time I returned home, Derek's car was gone, but Lila was in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone. I didn't say a word. I walked past her and into my room. I pulled up the security app I had quietly installed and double-checked the hallway camera angle. Then I opened the notebook again and added 2 more lines under my checklist. Recorder's office alert filed, new mailbox secured. The next item on my list required a little more patience. I needed a clear moment, uninterrupted, to access the master documents on Derek's home computer. He never locked it. He thought he didn't need to. That was his first mistake. The opportunity came on Thursday morning. Lila had left to meet a friend for lunch, and Derek was outside working on the boat. I could hear him on the dock, cursing under his breath while trying to adjust something under the hull. His phone was on the table. The screen lit up, showing a calendar invite titled Boat Naming Ceremony. I sat down at his desk and started searching. Within minutes, I found a folder labeled Home Planning. Inside were scanned drafts of renovation layouts, cost estimates, and a list of upcoming guests for what they were calling the big reveal. There were notes in the margins. Lila had written down estimates for replacing furniture, updating flooring, and even moving my things into storage. She didn't write maybe. She wrote soon. But what caught my attention most was a document titled Final Transition Plan. It wasn't just about money. It was about full control, medical power of attorney, complete financial oversight. It was dated 2 weeks from now. They were building a legal wall around me, one that would take away every choice I had left. And they thought they were doing it quietly. I transferred the document onto a flash drive I kept on my keychain. Then I emailed a copy to Celia with the subject line, "They are accelerating." She replied 5 minutes later with one word, "Understood." That night, I made 2 phone calls from the gas station 3 miles out. One to Walter at the bank, to confirm we would freeze anything new under Derek's name tied to my accounts. The other to Celia, who would draft the first letter of objection to be sent to the notary firm Derek had used. When I returned, the house was dark. Derek was on the back deck, smoking. He said nothing when I walked past. Lila was asleep on the couch, the TV still on, playing one of those home renovation shows she loved so much. I stood there for a moment, watching the screen. The host was talking about open floor plans and fresh paint. Lila dreamed of building her future on my past. But I wasn't past yet. In the silence of that moment, I decided something. No more reacting. No more watching. It was time to prepare the stage. They had a party coming up. Boat naming, champagne, neighbours, smiles. I would let them plan it all. I would let them invite everyone they wanted. I would let them believe the show was theirs. But I would be the one to end it, and no one would see it coming. The invitations went out on a Wednesday. I knew because the printer jammed while Lila was trying to push them through, and she cursed loud enough for me to hear from the laundry room. By the time I stepped into the kitchen for water, she had the table covered in glossy cards, each one embossed with navy blue lettering and a gold trim. Derek sat across from her with a spreadsheet open on his laptop, cross-checking names. They were calling it the Boat Naming Celebration. There was no RSVP line, no mention of capacity limits. It was clear they wanted a crowd. Derek raised his head when I walked by, then quickly looked away. Lila barely acknowledged me at all. I paused long enough to read one of the cards upside down. It was addressed to a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in months. The message was brief. Join us as we celebrate the beginning of our new chapter. They had stopped saying my name out loud. They were writing me out of the house, and now, it seemed, out of the neighborhood too. That night, after they had gone to bed, I walked past the printer tray and slid one invitation into my notebook. Then I went back to my room, opened the bottom drawer of the cabinet, and pulled out the outline I had been working on since the day they changed the locks. I called it the event map. At the top, I listed the confirmed guests based on names I heard Derek mention. Beneath that, I created columns for potential witnesses, camera placement opportunities, timing blocks, and possible exits. I wasn't planning a party. I was staging a performance. And I was preparing for it like I once prepared payroll audits for state inspections, quietly, carefully, with everything double-checked. The next morning, I visited Celia again. I handed her the flash drive with a copy of the latest boat registry and the notarized contract Derek had filed listing himself as sole buyer. The funds, of course, had come directly from the stolen account. It was just enough proof to move forward with a temporary fraud flag at the local marina. She told me she needed 72 hours to coordinate the next steps. That was all I needed to hear. By Friday, the backyard was being transformed. Derek had hired a company to string lights across the trees and install rented deck chairs along the dock. A long folding table was placed near the waterline, draped in a pale blue cloth, with silver buckets ready for bottles of wine. The boat sat behind it all, gleaming and smug, like a trophy earned through honesty. Lila brought home 3 crates of party supplies. She unpacked champagne flutes and ceramic serving trays, smiling to herself. Her phone was always nearby, full of texts she never bothered to hide. Contractors, event planners, neighbors she used to ignore. She wanted everyone there. She wanted them to see what they had claimed as their own. I stood back and watched it all unfold. Then I made my calls. First was to the office of the local notary association. I requested that the notary Derek had used be contacted for formal questioning regarding oversight and undue influence. I provided the exact dates and times she had visited our house, along with a written statement about the physical and verbal conditions under which I had been asked to sign. Celia handled the submission. Second was to the recorder's office. I asked for a meeting with a supervisor to review my home's title status. I arrived with 3 years of documents, a copy of my will, and letters showing that no legal transfer of ownership had ever been finalized. I signed an affidavit that morning, requesting immediate notification of any future title activity. My house could no longer be touched without me knowing. Third, I sent a formal notice through Walter at the bank. He drafted an internal freeze on any outgoing wire transfers tied to the household address and placed a flag on Derek's sub-accounts. The funds were still in dispute, but the motion would buy me time. And time was the last thing Derek knew he was losing. With every day leading up to the party, I checked my list. I adjusted timing blocks. I walked through the backyard when no one was home and took photos of where the sound would carry best. I made sure the main power outlet could handle a projector. I cleaned the older speakers from the garage and tested volume levels on a Sunday morning when the neighborhood was quiet. I also found the perfect moment to place a camera inside the hallway coat closet, facing the kitchen. It had a clear view of the counter, where Derek and Lila often whispered when they thought I was asleep. I left it running. 2 days before the event, I captured something important. Derek was on the phone, pacing. His voice was low, annoyed. "She's still here. I thought she'd be gone by now." He paused, then continued. "No, the house isn't in my name yet. But it will be. She's too weak to fight this." Then he laughed, a short, clipped sound, and ended the call. I clipped the file, renamed it, and added it to the master folder I would bring with me to the marina office. On the eve of the celebration, Lila stayed up late cleaning silverware and writing names on place cards. Derek rehearsed his thank you speech out loud in the living room. It included a joke about how long it took to finally feel like they were building their future. I watched from the hallway. They thought this was a beginning, but I knew better. This wasn't the start of anything. It was the end. Saturday came without apology. The Florida heat rolled in thick by late morning, and the dock was already humming by noon. Strings of lights stretched overhead like festival banners. The folding chairs were arranged in clean rows, angled toward the water where Derek's prized boat bobbed lightly in the canal. A rented speaker system had been tested 3 times. Lila paced the deck in heels too high for wood planks, adjusting decorations and fussing over the table linens. The cooler was full of sparkling wine. The catering van arrived with sliders and shrimp cocktails. A man with a clipboard did a last-minute walkthrough, confirming the program with Derek, who stood in a pressed linen shirt, squinting at the glare. He looked proud, not nervous. He had no reason to be. In his mind, this was his day. Guests trickled in, some dressed like they were heading to a country club event, others in polos and sandals. They sipped drinks, took pictures in front of the boat, and complimented the weather. No one noticed me. I stayed seated in the front row, tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, a pale shawl over my shoulders. I looked like a guest. I looked harmless. By 3 o'clock, the crowd had settled. Derek tapped the microphone, waited for the buzz to die down, then stepped forward. "I want to thank everyone for being here," he began, smiling. "It means the world to Lila and me to finally share this part of our journey with the people who matter most. This boat represents not just hard work, but a fresh start, a home on the water, something built with vision." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the vessel behind him. A soft round of applause followed. "And of course," he continued, "we're also here to celebrate the home behind us, where this all began, where family took root and continues to grow." Another nod, another smile. Lila clutched her glass, grinning. He raised his hand as if preparing for a toast, but I stood up before he could finish. My voice came low but firm. "There's something I'd like to share before we go any further." Some heads turned. Others didn't recognize me right away. Lila looked confused. Derek froze, still holding the mic. I stepped closer to the screen that had been set up behind the speaker stand. It had been part of the setup they requested, intended to display photos of their renovation plans and a slideshow of their journey. But I had replaced the file. I pulled the remote from my shawl pocket, pressed the button, and stepped back. The screen lit up. The first image was a security camera still from inside the kitchen. It showed me, seated alone at the edge of the counter, holding a plastic container of leftovers, while Derek and Lila laughed in the background. The timestamp was clear. The faces were clearer. A few murmurs ran through the crowd. The screen shifted. A new clip began to play. Derek's voice filled the speakers. "She's still here. I thought she'd be gone by now." The image was dark, pulled from a hallway recording, but the voice was unmistakable. "No, the house isn't in my name yet, but it will be. She's too weak to fight this." The room fell quiet. Someone in the back adjusted their sunglasses. The next clip played. A notary's visit. A quiet signature. The camera's angle was subtle, but it captured enough. The hesitation in my hand. Derek's voice, coaxing. Lila standing nearby, arms crossed. Another image appeared. Bank records, names, amounts, 6 withdrawals in total, labeled, highlighted, each one tied to a sub-account Derek had opened under his name. A guest coughed. Another looked toward the exit. The final slide was short. A title deed. My name. Only my name. No signatures below it. No transfer. No sale. No surrender. Then the screen went dark. I didn't say a word. Derek dropped the microphone. Lila's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered against the wood. For a long second, no one moved. Then the first voice rose from the back. Is that real? Not a question, just disbelief. Another guest stepped forward, frowning. Then another. I stood still, my hands folded in front of me, watching Derek's shoulders rise and fall. He turned toward me, eyes wide, not in anger, in panic. You planned this, he said under his breath. I nodded, just once. Then I stepped aside as three uniformed men walked onto the deck. They were quiet. They wore plain jackets, no sirens, no shouting. One approached Derek and asked him to step away from the platform. Another walked toward the boat, carrying a thick folder. The third reached into his coat and unfolded a slip of paper. A temporary asset freeze order, filed under suspicion of financial misconduct, backed by documentation from the bank and the recorder's office. Lila tried to speak, but her voice caught. She took a step back, then another. The officer approaching the boat placed a red tag on the deck near the wheel, then another near the console. He looped a plastic zip through the lock and sealed it. The thud of the tag dropping against the fiberglass was the only sound in the air. The boat was no longer theirs. A reporter from the local paper had been invited by Lila, thinking this would be a feel-good story about a couple starting over. She was standing near the rear steps, taking photos in silence. Someone whispered the word fraud. Someone else said elder abuse. A neighbor I had known for 20 years walked over and placed her hand lightly on my arm. I didn't move. Derek was escorted off the dock. Not handcuffed, not yet, but isolated, quiet. Lila sat on the edge of a chair, both hands shaking. The party never resumed. The food was left untouched. The music never played. And I stayed there, standing on the dock they had decorated, in front of the boat they had bought with stolen money, in the home I had built with my bare hands. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. I simply breathed, one deep, steady breath, because the war wasn't over, but the first strike was mine. They left the dock that day humiliated, but not destroyed. That part was coming next. The boat sat quiet under the afternoon sun, roped off with the bright red tag that fluttered slightly every time the breeze picked up. The guests had scattered quickly after the video ended. Nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of what they now knew was a mess. Even the ones who had clapped politely for Derek earlier didn't look back as they slipped away. Most of them would never come around again. By the time the officers finished filing their initial report, Derek was pacing inside the house like a man whose roof had just collapsed. Lila had locked herself in the bathroom. I could hear her muffled sobs through the wall, though I wasn't sure if she was crying out of shame or because she knew what was coming next. I didn't need to guess. The boat had been paid for through a chain of silent withdrawals, each cleverly timed and dressed up as maintenance expenses or financial consolidation. It was all done through an account that was never meant to be touched. But what Derek didn't know was that months ago, before he ever made his first move, I had already flagged that account for fraud watch through Walter's bank. Walter had contacted me the moment the first suspicious movement triggered the system. Instead of stopping it outright, I told him to let it happen. I needed the pattern. I needed the proof. I wanted the entire trail, down to the minute, attached to Derek's name. Because a single bad decision could be explained. But a series, deliberate and spaced out, that told the full truth. By Monday morning, the report had made its way to the Financial Crimes Division. A formal investigation was now open, and the boat was listed under active asset review. No transfer, no sale, no movement of any kind. It would sit there, unused, its papers frozen, until the matter was resolved. But I wasn't done. At 9 a.m., I walked into Celia's office with a second folder. Inside were copies of emails Derek had sent to contractors, plans for the house, a timeline for renovations. One message to Lila mentioned boxing up my belongings. Another outlined ideas for turning the laundry room into an office. They spoke about me like I was already gone, as if I had never existed at all. Celia read each page slowly. When she was finished, she leaned back in her chair and nodded. "That's enough," she said. "We file for permanent injunctive relief. Today." She had already begun drafting the paperwork to present in housing court. It wasn't just about the house. It was about establishing that I had been coerced, isolated, and manipulated. That they had used my trust to gain access to property they had no legal right to claim. We weren't chasing them anymore. We were blocking them entirely. At noon, we submitted the emergency motion. By 3 o'clock, it was approved. Derek and Lila would receive a formal order by certified mail the next morning, restricting them from making any further financial or structural changes to the property without written approval from both the court and myself. Any violation would be considered contempt and subject to immediate penalty. That evening, as I prepared dinner for myself, I heard Derek arguing with someone on the phone. He was pacing again, louder this time, voice sharp with panic. I couldn't make out everything, but one sentence rang clear through the hallway. She was supposed to be easy to manage. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. He had always underestimated the quiet ones. The next day, Lila tried to act like nothing had happened. She made a smoothie in the blender, wearing a robe that still had the hotel tag stitched inside the sleeve. She even asked if I wanted anything, like we were still some kind of family. I shook my head and returned to my room. Half an hour later, a knock came at the door. It was the courier with the court order. Derek took the envelope without reading it at first, until he noticed the return address. Then he turned pale. He read it in silence, then folded it, walked into the living room, and sat down without a word. Lila followed him moments later, holding her phone, scrolling through messages that offered no escape. The kitchen went quiet. The boat stayed docked, and the locks on the front door remained unchanged. That night, I took a long walk down by the water, past the docks, past the marina, past the place where the seagulls liked to gather near the boat ramps. I thought about the years I had spent holding back, about how many times I had let things go, hoping it would make me more lovable, less difficult, easier to live with, and how none of it had ever protected me. Kindness is not armor. It is not a shield. Not when you're standing in front of people who see your softness as a doorway to take more. I sat on the bench facing the canal, watching the reflection of the street lamps ripple over the surface. Somewhere behind me, Derek was learning the difference between control and ownership, between inheritance and theft, between love and leverage, and I had no intention of teaching that lesson twice. The next morning, a second courier arrived. This one carried a notice from the bank, account closure pending, due to contested ownership and misuse of joint access. It was addressed to Derek, and it came with a 21-day window for response. He didn't speak to me for the rest of the day. But silence, I had learned, is not always absence. Sometimes it's surrender. The morning the title freeze took effect, the wind along the canal felt sharper than usual. The dock was still. The red tag on the boat hadn't moved. I stood at the kitchen window watching it sway gently with the water, the silence of the scene hiding everything it represented. No one was boarding that vessel. No sail, no parade, no power. Derek hadn't left the house in 2 days. He stopped answering phone calls after the bank notice arrived. Lila still made herself visible, walking from room to room in tight gym clothes with a smoothie in hand, pretending everything was normal. She never asked how I was. She never looked me in the eye. It was easier to act like I was furniture. But they both knew the truth was closing in. That week, a formal notification was posted on the house, taped in a plastic sleeve to the side gate. It was from the recorder's office, acknowledging the court's recognition of my sole ownership and the active injunction. Beneath it, a second paper was added 2 hours later by a courier from the marina's legal department. The slip listed the ongoing investigation into fraudulent use of elder funds to obtain watercraft. The documents weren't accusations, they were confirmation. Everything I had prepared had moved into action. The law was no longer a threat hanging over their heads, it was a wall built around them. Lila tried to remove the papers, tugging them off the gate while swearing under her breath. But I had already taken photos, sent them to Celia, posted copies to the bank, the recorder, the court file. The originals were filed. These were just the visible signs of what they could no longer hide. That afternoon, Derek finally stepped out. He wore a faded polo, no shoes, and the kind of look a man wears when he realizes no one's coming to save him. He walked down to the dock, stared at the red tag, then kicked one of the mooring ropes hard enough to knock over a planter. It didn't help. He called someone while pacing the edge, shouting into his phone, desperate for a solution. But whatever answer he was hoping for never came. He ended the call with his head in his hands. I watched all of it from the hallway. Later that night, I found the living room dark and empty, the television left on with the volume muted. The screen showed some cooking show, a woman whisking cream like she had never known betrayal. I turned it off. On the coffee table sat a folder. Inside were printed plans for the renovation Derek and Lila had drafted weeks before. Updated estimates, contractor agreements, paint swatches. There was even a drafted announcement for a neighborhood newsletter, calling it a generational home upgrade. I flipped through each page, then placed them all back in order. The next morning, I met Celia outside the courthouse. We walked through a side entrance and up 2 flights to the Civil Records Division. She handed the clerk a packet of updated documents, including copies of the surveillance footage, the contractor emails, and the altered bank drafts. Then she turned to me and said something I hadn't expected. "This is the last thing you'll need to sign." I took the pen, signed the final form, and placed my hand flat on the page for a moment. Not for balance, for closure. By the end of the day, the fraud filing had moved from complaint to confirmed status. Derek was no longer under suspicion. He was under review. 2 days later, an inspector from the Department of Elder Services rang the doorbell. He wasn't loud. He didn't come with a badge or handcuffs, just a clipboard and a quiet voice. He spoke with me first, sat at the kitchen table, asked how long things had been happening, took notes without interrupting. Then he asked to speak with Derek and Lila. They sat in the dining room for nearly an hour. I didn't listen, but I didn't need to. When the inspector left, he handed me a final copy of his notes, stating clearly that financial abuse indicators had been confirmed. He didn't say when action would be taken, just that it would be soon. That evening, the silence in the house felt different. It wasn't tension, it was decay. The kind that settles when people know they've lost but are still pretending they can negotiate. Lila came into the kitchen around sunset. Her tone was clipped, but her words tried to carry grace. "We're thinking of staying with her sister for a few weeks." I didn't respond. She waited, then turned and left. By morning, the guest room was empty, the bed stripped, no note, no apology. Derek followed the next day. I heard him loading his car at dawn. The trunk slammed twice, tires rolled over gravel, and just like that, the house was quiet again. I walked through each room slowly. The living room still had the candle holders I bought on my 50th birthday. The curtains hadn't been changed. My rocking chair still sat by the window, where I used to watch the tide come in. But now, everything felt different. The boat stayed docked, untouched. The legal flags on it would last for months, maybe years. The house was mine again, on paper and in spirit. The damage was real, but so was the reckoning. They had tried to erase me, to push me out quietly, like a page in a book no one reads anymore. But they forgot I wrote the first chapter, and I had just finished writing the one they would never forget. The morning they left, I waited until the house was still before unlocking the front door and stepping onto the porch. The sunlight was soft, not yet punishing. I stood there for a while, listening to the birds along the canal, the distant hum of a lawnmower 2 streets over. Peace had returned, but not by accident. It had been built, piece by piece, with intention. I stepped back inside, shut the door behind me, and locked it, not out of fear, but because I could. The envelope was waiting for me on the dining table. Celia had dropped it off the day before, just as Lila was carrying out the last of her suitcases. Inside was the official confirmation from the recorder's office. Sole ownership reinstated, all fraudulent filings expunged, injunction upheld. I opened the folder slowly and ran my hand across the first page. The title deed. My name. Alone. Clean. They had tried to make me a guest in my own home. But guests don't get to change locks. Guests don't call the contractor and order new windows. And guests certainly don't rename the property on neighborhood paperwork. I walked through each room that morning, taking my time. The kitchen, finally quiet. No more tension hanging between cabinets. No more passive sighs when I opened the fridge. I wiped down the counter with lemon oil, not to clean it, but to mark it. It belonged to me again. The hallway still had the faint scent of Lila's perfume, but it would fade. I opened the windows to let it out. Let it drift, the way she had drifted from pretending to care into full control. She had always been subtle, calculated, but even the smartest thieves underestimate the people they step on. In the back room, the laundry baskets were still stacked neatly, the same way I had kept them for years. They had never changed it because they never planned to do laundry themselves. They assumed I would still be here, folding quietly, cooking quietly, disappearing quietly. But I had learned to stop disappearing. I returned to the living room and placed the envelope on the mantel. I didn't frame it. I didn't need to. I had no desire to decorate the aftermath, but I kept it visible, for myself. Later that day, I called Celia to let her know I received the paperwork. Her voice carried a calm I hadn't heard in a long time. Not victory, closure. She told me Derek's attorney had finally responded. The message was brief. They were not contesting the ruling, no appeals, no challenges. It was done. That meant the financial fraud case would move forward without delay. Derek had 30 days to respond to the bank's final notice, which now included not just the stolen funds, but the attempt to modify property without consent. If he ignored it, the bank would pursue a civil judgment. If he fought it, every document I had collected would be used. Leela, for her part, had vanished from the public side of things. Her social media accounts were deactivated. Her name was removed from the business directory she used to manage. She was trying to outrun the consequences, but the paperwork moved slower than shame. And it always caught up. I didn't rejoice in that. Not exactly. I just knew it had to happen. Some things can't be talked through. They have to be brought to light. The boat, still docked at the edge of the canal, remained untouched. A second red tag had been added, this one from the insurance investigator. Celia said they were waiting on valuation before pursuing asset forfeiture. If confirmed, the boat would be auctioned. The proceeds would be used to begin recovery of the funds Derek had taken. Irony, I thought, had a funny way of docking at the same place twice. That evening, I opened the small box I kept in the bottom drawer of the buffet. Inside were photographs, none newer than 10 years. One of Derek as a boy, standing barefoot in the backyard, mud up to his knees. Another of him holding his high school diploma, eyes full of some version of hope I no longer recognized. I set those aside and looked at a picture of the house taken from the street, before we ever remodeled. I remembered painting the trim myself. I remembered choosing the shutters. I remembered planting the rose bushes that no longer bloomed but still stood, stubborn and thorned, near the fence. This house had been my life's work, even when no one called it that. They called it comfort. They called it inheritance. They called it a stepping stone. But they never called it mine, until now. 2 days later, I received an official notice from the Department of Elder Services. Their report confirmed a verified incident of financial coercion and emotional neglect. It wouldn't result in jail time, not yet, but it would stay on record. Derek and Lila would be barred from acting as financial proxies or caregivers in the future. It wasn't revenge. It was protection. The doorbell rang just before sunset. A neighbor dropped off some mail that had been misdelivered. As she turned to leave, she paused. "I'm glad it's quiet again," she said. I nodded. No need to explain. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea and listened to the creak of the house as it settled. Wood expanding, air shifting, time bending around familiar corners. The same walls they tried to claim still held my memories, my silence, my strength. This was never their house. It never would be. 3 weeks passed before I heard his voice again. It was a Tuesday morning, late spring. The kind of day where the breeze sneaks through the screens and smells like cut grass and salt. I was in the kitchen sorting paperwork when the doorbell rang. Not the quick kind of ring people use when dropping off packages. It was slower, heavier, a sound that lingered in the hall even after it stopped. I opened the door and found Derek standing there. No suitcase, no apology in his eyes, just tiredness. His hands were in his pockets, the same way he used to stand as a boy when he had something to hide. He didn't ask to come in. He just waited. And I stepped aside. We walked into the living room. I didn't offer coffee. He didn't expect it. He sat on the edge of the couch, not leaning back, not relaxing. He stared at the floor like it might open and swallow the words he hadn't said yet. I waited. He cleared his throat. The sound broke the silence more than his voice. "I got the final notice from the bank," he said, "and the letter from the court." I nodded. "They said I have until the end of the month to respond, or they'll file judgment." He looked up at me then, finally. His face wasn't angry. It wasn't even ashamed. It was hollow. I thought I could fix it before it got that far. There was no response I needed to give. Everything that had needed saying was already written, in bank statements, in court filings, in the voice clips I had submitted. He had made his choices long before this conversation. Still, I let him sit with the silence. I had learned that silence teaches louder than scolding. "I didn't think it would go that far," he repeated. The phrase hung in the room like a fog. "I know," I said. He took that in, not as comfort, as confirmation. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers intertwined, a posture of someone trying to hold themselves together. "I lost the boat," he said. That I already knew. The marina had claimed it officially 2 days earlier, and Celia had sent me the formal asset report. The auction date was already set, but I said nothing. "It was never really mine," he added. Still, I said nothing. Derek leaned back slowly. He looked around the living room like he didn't recognize it anymore, as if the furniture had betrayed him. "I thought you'd be gone," he said. "I thought you wouldn't fight me." That was the most honest thing he had said since stepping through the door. "I know," I said again, and I meant it. He hadn't expected a fight, not because I was weak, but because I was quiet, because I had fed him, housed him, forgiven him, and somehow that had translated in his mind to surrender. "I don't know what to do now," he said. This time, I let the silence last longer. I wanted him to feel what uncertainty tasted like. "You don't have to answer," he added. "I just needed to say it out loud." He stood up then, slowly, looked around one more time. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I wrote it down, everything I touched, what accounts, when. "Lila won't be giving you anything, but I will." He placed the envelope on the coffee table. Then, for the first time in months, he looked me in the eye. "I'm sorry," he said. Not loudly, not dramatically, just flat, like a sentence he'd been practicing in his head and finally ran out of excuses not to say. I didn't speak. He nodded once, turned, and walked to the door. No pause. No waiting for forgiveness. When he closed the door behind him, the house felt no heavier, no lighter, just whole again. I sat on the couch and opened the envelope. Inside was a list, handwritten in Derek's blocky script. Dates, transfers, names of people who helped him. A full trail. The final piece. Celia would be pleased. The timeline would be airtight now. But what struck me more was how neat it was, how deliberately he had written it, like someone finally choosing to tell the truth. I placed the envelope inside my case file and closed it. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. The rose bushes were budding again, small green tips pushing from old stems. I knelt down and trimmed the weeds near the base. The soil was warm, forgiving. It reminded me that growth comes even after neglect. Later, I walked to the dock. The red tag was gone now. The boat had already been moved. The slip sat empty, water rocking softly against the pilings. I stood at the edge for a while, watching the ripples. No sound but the water. Derek's visit hadn't changed anything, but it had ended something. That mattered. I went back inside and lit a candle. Not for him, for me. Not everything broken needs to be rebuilt. Some things need to be left in the water. Let the tide carry them out. That evening, the sky turned gold, and the house, my house, stayed quiet. Not in grief, not in fear, in peace. The envelope Derek left behind didn't just confirm what we already knew, it clarified the quiet parts, the whispered instructions, the payments made under other names, the people who looked the other way. Every step logged in his uneven handwriting. There were no excuses written down, no justifications, just the facts. And for me, that was enough. Celia called 2 days after I handed her the file. Her voice was steady, efficient. She said the new evidence would close the gap in the timeline, that it would make the recovery process smoother and leave less room for Derek to maneuver. It also gave the Financial Crimes Unit leverage. They were moving forward. I didn't ask how fast. I didn't need to know the exact day the hammer would fall. The work had already been done. What followed now was just the slow weight of consequence. The bank filed for recovery of assets on a Thursday. The paperwork named Derek directly. A lien was placed on his accounts. His credit lines were flagged. The brokerage account he shared with Lila was locked under review. None of it came with handcuffs. But it came with limits. And that was sometimes a harder prison to live in. Derek called once. He didn't leave a message. Lila didn't call at all. The house was quiet. But this time it wasn't because someone had taken my voice. It was because no one else's voice belonged here anymore. I spent the week fixing small things. I replaced the drawer slide in the hallway chest that had been sticking for years. I oiled the hinges on the front door. I scrubbed the grout in the guest bathroom and repotted the succulents near the kitchen window. It wasn't out of stress or to stay busy. It was restoration. I wasn't patching over damage. I was choosing what stayed. One morning, while checking the mailbox, I found a letter from the Department of Elder Services. It wasn't long, just a brief line, confirming the closure of their report and the placement of Derek and Lila on the restricted caregiver registry. Their names would now be flagged in any future applications involving elderly financial oversight. A small thing, but small things add up. That afternoon, I went into the garage and opened the last storage bin I had avoided for years. Inside were old photos, but also older notebooks, grocery lists from decades ago, home repair invoices, a folded paper with my mother's handwriting on it, written in Spanish. She had written it before she passed. A reminder about forgiveness, about waiting until the wound is fully closed before deciding whether to open your hand again. I read it twice, then folded it back. Forgiveness, I had learned, isn't something you give because someone earns it. Sometimes you give it because you're ready to let go of what their weight has done to you. The final ruling in my case arrived in the mail the next week. It came in a plain envelope, stamped with the seal of the court. I opened it at the dining table where so many documents had sat before. The contents were simple. The permanent injunction would stand. All financial access for Derek and Lila was legally severed. Full restitution was to be pursued through civil court. The house was declared protected under my sole estate. It was done. No more hearings, no more documents, no more watching my life from the corner of a room I built. That night, I didn't pour wine. I didn't toast anything. I sat on the back porch with a glass of water, bare feet on the old wood, listening to the slow churn of the canal. The boat slip was still empty, but I didn't mind the silence it left behind. I thought about the years I had spent putting everyone else first. The meals, the bills, the sacrifices I assumed were expected, and how those quiet choices were never seen as strength, only as an invitation to be ignored or replaced. But now, with every breath, I could feel my own name returning to the walls. It wasn't about pride, it was about recognition. I wasn't just the woman who lived here. I was the reason the house stood at all. Later that week, the neighbor from 2 doors down dropped off a plant, a small peace lily in a white ceramic pot. She didn't stay long, just said she had heard everything was settled and was glad to see me outside again. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. The plant now sits near the front window. It catches light just before noon. Some days I water it, some days I forget. But it doesn't seem to mind. It's still growing, just like me. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was clean. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to fill it. It didn't end with a letter, or a ruling, or even an apology. It ended with the sun coming through the same kitchen window that had watched me age, a slow, warm morning that smelled like brewed coffee and orange peel. That was how I knew it was over. Not because the fight was loud, but because the quiet finally felt earned. I sat at the table in my cotton robe, one leg tucked under the other, notebook in hand. Not the same one I had used to track Derek's steps. That one was tucked away now, sealed and stored. This one was new. The cover still stiff, pages uncreased. A different kind of record. Not a defense, a beginning. In it, I started writing things I hadn't written in years. Simple things. The name of the man who trimmed the trees along the fence every spring. The recipe for the bread my mother used to bake when money was tight. The day the mailman mentioned retiring and smiled like he was ready for peace. These were not dramatic things, but they were mine, and they were real. The house creaked gently as the wind moved through the walls. No tension, just age. Honest, familiar age. Every scratch in the floorboards, every uneven step near the back door, told the story of a life that had been lived with purpose, even if no one had said thank you at the time. Some days I stayed in. I listened to old records or rearranged the pantry. Other days I walked along the canal, saying hello to the ducks that had nested near the boat slip. That slip was still empty. I had no plans to replace the boat. That part of the story belonged to someone else. I had no need for water that moved too fast. I had learned to love solid ground. The rose bushes came back, one bloom at a time. They hadn't flowered in nearly 2 years, but I hadn't pulled them out. I had left them be, trusting they knew when it was safe to grow again. One afternoon, I saw a single pink bloom open near the base of the fence. I stood there for a long time, just watching it hold its shape in the breeze. The court didn't call again. The bank confirmed closure, no more signatures, no more meetings, no more forms to review. The final deposit from the civil judgment came through in late May, deposited directly into the account that bore only my name. I looked at the balance once, then closed the screen. I didn't need to stare at the number. What I valued now couldn't be measured that way. One morning, I baked cornbread and brought a loaf to the neighbor who had dropped off the peace lily. She cried when I handed it to her, said it reminded her of her mother. We didn't talk long. We didn't need to. Some healing happens just by standing next to someone who understands weight. By early summer, the house felt like mine in ways it never had before. Not just in title, not just in silence, but in rhythm. The way the air moved, the way the light hit the kitchen tiles. Even the sound of my footsteps, slow and steady on the wooden floor, reminded me I was here. Still here. I didn't forgive Derek with words. I forgave him with distance, with the decision to stop shrinking just to keep someone else comfortable. I let him carry the truth now. Let him wake up each morning and remember the lines he crossed. That burden was his, not mine. Lila never returned, not even for her things. Someone else came to collect what was left. Most of it went to storage. I didn't ask where. The energy it took to wonder had left me. What I had reclaimed was too valuable to waste on ghosts. Some stories end with fireworks, others with silence. Mine ended with breath. A full, deep breath I could finally take without fear of what came next. The house is not new, but it is whole. And so am I. If you're still here, thank you for listening to my story. Maybe parts of it reminded you of someone. Or maybe you needed to hear how silence can become strength. If this touched you in any way, take a deep breath right now. That one is yours. Keep it. Let it remind you that no matter what they try to take, your voice is never gone. Not if you choose to use it.